in the coastal city of Kamakura, during the year 1285, a weaver named Hana tends to her loom in the quiet hours of morning, her hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who has known this work since childhood. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to Kamakura, where we will follow Hana through her daily work at the loom. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Hana, 27 years old, sat before her loom as pale light filtered through the paper screens of her workshop. Her nimble fingers calloused from years of handling silk, thread moved across the wooden frame with barely a sound. The morning air carried the scent of salt from the nearby sea, mingling with the faint sweetness of cherry wood that formed her loom's sturdy frame. She had woken before dawn, as was her custom, finding comfort in these still hours when the city remained wrapped in slumber. The silk threads stretched before her in orderly rows, each one dyed the color of autumn leaves, deep amber, soft rust, touches of golden yellow. She had prepared these threads herself over many days, soaking them in dye made from safflower petals and the bark of certain trees. The process had required patience, checking the color repeatedly until it matched the image she carried in her mind. Now the threads waited, ready to become cloth under her steady guidance. Her hands knew the work without conscious thought. The shuttle passed through the shed, carrying the weft thread from one side to the other. She pressed the beater forward, settling the new thread snugly against those already woven. Then her feet worked the treadles, changing which threads rose and which fell, creating the pattern she had planned. Each movement flowed into the next with a rhythm that seemed to slow time itself, making the moments stretch and deepen. The workshop around her held the accumulated tools of her craft. Spindles rested in a wooden box near the wall, their surfaces smooth from handling. Baskets contained thread in various stages of preparation, some still rough and uneven, others perfectly spun and ready for dyeing. Clay pots held dried flowers and bark for future dye batches, their contents giving off a subtle, earthy fragrance that had seeped into the wooden walls over the years. Through the paper screens, she could hear the first sounds of the neighborhood stirring. Someone's wooden sandals clicked against stone as they made their way down the narrow street. A door slid open with its characteristic whisper, then closed again. These familiar sounds formed a backdrop to her work, reassuring in their predictability. Hana continued weaving, her breathing matching the gentle pace of the shuttle's passage. The cloth grew gradually beneath her hands, row by row. She paused occasionally to run her fingers across the woven surface, checking for evenness, feeling the texture develop. The silk had a coolness against her skin, smooth and slightly yielding. Satisfied, she resumed her work, humming a melody her mother had taught her, a simple tune that spoke of mountain streams and pine forests. When the light through the screens shifted from gray to soft gold, Hana set down her shuttle. She rose from her seat, feeling the pleasant stiffness in her shoulders that came from focused work. Moving to a low table near the window, she prepared tea with the same unhurried care she brought to her weaving. The charcoal in her small brazier glowed steady and warm, heating the iron kettle until steam began to rise in delicate wisps. She measured tea leaves into a ceramic pot, their dried fragrance sharp and clean. The water, when she poured it, made a gentle rushing sound that filled the quiet room. While the tea steeped, she stood by the window, looking out at the small garden behind her workshop. Morning glory vines climbed a bamboo trellis, their blossoms just beginning to open in the strengthening light. Dew still clung to the leaves, each droplet catching the sun and holding it for a moment before releasing it again. The tea, when she poured it into a simple clay cup, sent up wisps of fragrant steam. She cupped her hands around the vessel, absorbing its warmth. The first sip brought a mild bitterness that slowly gave way to a subtle sweetness. She drank slowly, standing by the window, watching the garden wake. A small brown bird landed on the trellis, tilted its head, then flew away again. The morning glory blossoms continued their gradual opening, their petals unfurling like tiny scrolls. Returning to her loom, Hana settled back into position. Her fingers found the shuttle, and the rhythm resumed as naturally as breathing. The threads crossed and recrossed, building the pattern she had envisioned, a design of flowing water suggested by subtle shifts in the weave's texture. She had learned this pattern from her aunt, who had learned it from her own teacher many years before. Each time she wove it, Hana felt connected to that long line of weavers, all of them working with the same patient attention. The hours passed in this measured way. The shuttle traveled back and forth. Her feet pressed the treadles. The beater settled each new thread into place. Outside, the sounds of the city grew more active, voices calling greetings, cart wheels rumbling over stone, the distant ring of a temple bell marking the passage of time. But inside the workshop, Hana's world remained focused and still, bounded by the frame of her loom and the steady progression of her work. By midday, when warm light filled the room and made the silk threads glow, she had added several more inches to the cloth. She paused to eat a simple meal of rice and pickled vegetables, sitting on the floor near the window. The rice was slightly warm still, each grain separate and tender. The pickles provided a sharp contrast, their vinegar tang awakening her senses. She ate slowly, mindfully, tasting each mouthful, grateful for the nourishment. After eating, she prepared fresh water in a basin and washed her hands and face. The water was cool against her skin, refreshing. She patted herself dry with a hemp cloth, then returned to the loom. But before resuming her weaving, she spent time preparing more thread for future work. This task required different movements, drawing out the raw silk, twisting it gently but firmly, winding it onto spindles. Her hands moved with practiced ease, and she found herself humming again, the same melody as before. The afternoon light took on a golden quality as it streamed through the paper screens. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, visible one moment and gone the next. Hana worked on, feeling the deep contentment that came from purposeful labor, from seeing something grow gradually under her attention. The silk cloth lengthened, its pattern emerging with increasing clarity. She could already imagine it finished, perhaps as part of a garment, perhaps as a wall hanging in someone's home, bringing beauty and warmth to their daily life. When the light began to soften toward evening, she carefully secured her work and covered the loom with a hemp cloth to protect it from dust. She tidied her workspace, returning tools to their proper places, sweeping the floor with a broom made of bound grass. Each action carried the same measured quality as her weaving, neither rushed nor prolonged, simply done with full attention. The workshop settled into evening quiet. Hana lit a small oil lamp, its flame steady and golden. She sat for a while near the window, watching the sky deepen from blue to indigo. The garden outside grew dim. The morning glory blossoms closed now, resting until dawn would call them open again. The air cooled, and she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, appreciating its soft warmth. Tomorrow she would return to the loom, and the cloth would grow longer still. The pattern would continue to emerge, thread by thread, row by row. But for now, the day's work was complete. She sat in the lamplight, her nimble fingers resting quietly in her lap, her breathing slow and even, surrounded by the familiar scents and textures of her craft, present in this moment of stillness as the city around her settled into night. The next morning arrived with the same gentle progression as always. Hana, 27 years old, woke before the sun had fully risen and moved through her small living quarters with the unhurried grace that defined all her actions. She washed her face in cool water from a ceramic basin, feeling the refreshing touch against her skin. The water dripped from her nimble fingers as she patted herself dry, each drop catching faint light from the paper-screened windows. She dressed in her work clothing, a simple indigo robe that had softened with countless washings. The fabric settled against her shoulders with familiar comfort, and she tied the sash with movements her hands had performed so many times they required no thought. Her hair she gathered and pinned with a wooden comb, one that her aunt had given her years ago. The smooth grain of the wood pressed gently against her scalp, holding everything neatly in place. In the small kitchen area, she prepared a breakfast of millet porridge. The grain had soaked overnight, and now it cooked slowly over low coals, releasing a mild, nutty aroma that filled the morning air. She stirred it occasionally with a wooden spoon, watching the consistency gradually thicken. When it was ready, she ladled it into a bowl and added a few pickled plum pieces, their tartness providing balance to the grain's subtle sweetness. She ate sitting on a cushion by the window, savoring each spoonful while watching the sky brighten. After cleaning her breakfast dishes, she made her way to the workshop. The loom stood where she had left it, covered and waiting. She removed the hemp cloth with care, folding it and setting it aside. The partially woven silk caught the early light, its amber and rust colors seeming to glow from within. She settled onto her seat, feeling her body remember the position, her feet finding the treadles without searching. Her hands lifted the shuttle and the weaving resumed. The thread passed through the shed with a soft whisper. The beater pressed forward, settling everything firmly. Her feet worked the treadles in their established pattern. The rhythm surrounded her, steady as a heartbeat, pulling her into that focused state where time seemed to lose its usual meaning. Each thread added to the whole, contributing to the design that flowed like water across the cloth's surface. The morning progressed in this measured way. Outside, she could hear the sounds of neighbors beginning their own daily work. The rhythmic thump of someone pounding rice drifted through the air. Farther away, a merchant called out, advertising fresh fish from the morning's catch. These sounds blended into a familiar backdrop, the texture of ordinary life continuing around her while she remained absorbed in her task. By late morning, a visitor arrived. Hana heard the soft footsteps approaching, then a gentle knock at the doorframe. She secured her shuttle and rose to greet the caller, an elderly woman named Yuki who lived several houses down the street. Yuki's weathered face creased into a smile as Hana slid open the door, inviting her inside with a gesture of welcome. "I have brought you chrysanthemum petals," Yuki said, holding out a cloth bundle. Her voice carried the softness of advanced years, each word carefully formed. "From my garden, I thought perhaps you might use them for dyeing." Hana accepted the bundle with both hands, bowing her gratitude. She untied the cloth to reveal petals in shades of yellow and white, still fresh with morning dew. The flowers gave off a clean, slightly sharp fragrance. "These are beautiful," she said. "I will make a dye bath this afternoon. Would you like some tea?" They settled near the window, and Hana prepared tea with the same care she had shown the previous day. The two women sat in comfortable silence for a time, sipping from their cups, watching the light play across the garden. Yuki's presence brought a peaceful quality to the space, her own deep contentment evident in the way she held her cup, in the slight smile that seemed always to rest on her features. "Your weaving progresses well," Yuki observed, nodding toward the loom. Her eyes, though aged, remained sharp and observant. "It grows as all things grow, gradually, with patience," Hana replied. She appreciated how Yuki understood the nature of such work, never hurrying conversation, allowing spaces between words to stretch and breathe. After finishing their tea, Yuki took her leave and Hana returned to her loom. But she found herself thinking about the chrysanthemum petals, imagining the color they would yield. Perhaps a soft yellow, delicate as early spring light, or maybe something deeper, richer. The only way to know would be to try, to let the petals give what they would give. When the afternoon light grew warm and full, she decided to begin preparing the dye bath. She filled a large clay pot with water from the barrel she kept in the garden, carrying it inside with both hands. The water settled in the pot with barely a ripple. She built up the fire beneath it, adding charcoal pieces one by one until the flames burned steady and even. Then she added the chrysanthemum petals Yuki had brought, watching them float on the surface before gradually beginning to sink. As the water heated, she prepared the thread she would dye hanks of undyed silk that she had spun earlier in the week. She had already treated them with a mordant to help the color bind, and now they hung ready, waiting for their transformation. The water in the pot began to steam, and the petals released their essence. The liquid gradually took on a golden hue, pale at first, then deepening as the petals gave up their color. Hana stirred the pot with a long wooden stick, her movements slow and circular. The fragrance of the chrysanthemums intensified with the heat, filling the workshop with their distinctive scent. She found herself humming again, that same melody from before, her voice soft and slightly husky. The act of stirring became meditative, the circular motion repeating endlessly, her attention fully present with the task. When the color seemed right, she carefully lowered the silk hanks into the dye bath. They absorbed the liquid immediately, darkening as they took in the color. She moved them gently through the pot, ensuring even coverage, watching as the white silk transformed into gold. The heat from the fire warmed her face and hands, a pleasant sensation that made her aware of her body, of the simple physical comfort of warmth on a temperate day. She left the silk to soak while she prepared her evening meal. From her stores, she took dried fish, a few radishes, and rice. She cooked the rice in a pot over the brazier, its familiar aroma gradually filling the space. The fish she grilled briefly, just enough to warm it through and release its savory smell. The radishes she sliced thin and arranged on a small plate, their white flesh crisp and clean-looking. While the food cooked, she returned to check the dyeing silk. The color had deepened beautifully a golden yellow with subtle variations in tone that would add richness to any cloth woven from it. She lifted the hanks from the pot using a stick, letting the excess dye drip back into the bath. Then she carried them outside to hang in the garden, where they could cool and dry in the evening air. The wet silk caught the lowering sun, the water droplets on its surface glinting like tiny jewels. Hana stood for a moment, admiring the way the color seemed to hold light within itself. A mild breeze stirred the hanks, making them sway gently on the line she had strung between two posts. The movement was hypnotic, peaceful to watch. She could already envision these threads on her loom, woven into patterns alongside the autumn-colored silk she was currently working with. Returning inside, she ate her evening meal slowly, tasting each element: the tender rice, the flaky fish, the crisp radish with its slight peppery note. She chewed thoroughly, giving her body time to receive the nourishment, feeling gratitude for the food and for the simple ability to sit and eat in peace. Through the window, she could see the dyed silk still hanging, now silhouetted against the deepening sky. After cleaning her dishes, she spent the remaining daylight hours preparing more thread at her spinning wheel. The wheel turned with a soft, rhythmic creaking, and the raw silk twisted into usable thread under her guiding hands. This work required different attention than weaving: a constant monitoring of tension and thickness, an ongoing adjustment to keep the thread even. Her nimble fingers moved continuously, drawing out the fiber, pinching and releasing, allowing the twist to travel up the strand. The motion created its own kind of meditation. Her hands knew what to do, allowing her mind to rest in a state of relaxed awareness. She watched the thread emerge from her fingers, watched it wind onto the spindle, adding to the growing store of material for future projects. The wheel's turning seemed to mark time in its own way, each revolution a small completion, a tiny cycle within the larger cycles of days and seasons. As twilight settled, she lit her oil lamp and continued working by its gentle light. The flame remained steady, casting a golden glow across the workspace. Shadows gathered in the corners, but the sphere of lamplight felt cozy and contained, a small world sufficient unto itself. She continued spinning until her hands grew tired, then finally stopped, banking the fire and preparing for sleep. Before retiring, she stepped out into the garden one last time. The night air was cool against her face, carrying scents of earth and growing things. Stars had emerged overhead, scattered across the dark expanse like rice grains spilled on indigo cloth. The dyed silk hung motionless now, the breeze having died down. She touched one of the hanks gently, finding it still slightly damp. By morning, it would be dry and ready to bring inside. She returned to her sleeping quarters and spread her futon on the tatami mats. The rice straw inside the mats gave off a faint, pleasant scent when she lay down upon them. She pulled a light quilt over herself, feeling its comforting weight settle across her body. Through the paper screens, she could see the faint glow of stars, and from somewhere in the distance came the soft hooting of an owl, its call repeated at long intervals. Hana, 27 years old, lay with her nimble fingers resting on her stomach, her breathing slow and even. She thought about the work waiting tomorrow, more weaving, the newly dyed thread to wind and prepare, perhaps other tasks that would arise as they always did. But these thoughts carried no urgency, no weight of anxiety. They were simply the natural awareness of life's ongoing flow, of work that would continue day after day, season after season, each task following the last in an order that felt right and proper. Sleep came gradually, like the tide rising on the nearby shore. Her body relaxed completely into the futon. Her mind grew quiet and still, and she drifted into rest with the same gentle ease that characterized all her movements, all her days. The following morning brought mist from the sea, a soft gray veil that wrapped the city in hushed mystery. Hana woke and moved through her morning routine, washing and dressing with the same measured care. When she went outside to retrieve the dried silk, the mist dampened her face and hands, cool and refreshing. The hanks of thread were dry as she had expected, the yellow color even more beautiful in the diffused light. She brought them inside and spent the early hours winding the dyed silk onto bobbins, preparing it for eventual use on her loom. The thread passed through her fingers smoothly, its texture transformed by the dyeing process from rough to silken. She worked at a small table near the window, where the misty light was strongest, her hands performing the winding motion over and over, building neat layers of golden thread on each wooden bobbin. The mist persisted through the morning, muffling all sounds from outside. The city seemed to retreat, leaving her workshop as an island of focused activity in a sea of gray silence. She appreciated this occasional withdrawal from the usual bustle, this inward-turning quality that mist brought to the world. It seemed fitting for work that required concentration and care. By midday, the mist had begun to lift, revealing patches of blue sky between the thinning veils of gray. Hana prepared and ate her noon meal, then returned to her weaving. The cloth on the loom had grown substantially, and she could now see the full pattern emerging, those suggestions of flowing water, created not through color but through the texture of the weave itself. Running her hand across the surface, she felt the subtle variations, the places where threads rose and fell in their ordained pattern. She wove through the afternoon, pausing only when her shoulders stiffened or her eyes grew tired. During these brief rests, she stood and stretched, rolled her shoulders, looked out at the garden where the mist had finally cleared completely. The morning glory vines showed new growth, their tendrils reaching upward along the bamboo trellis. A butterfly visited the blossoms, its wings opening and closing slowly as it fed. She watched until it flew away, then returned to her loom. The days continued in this pattern weaving, spinning, dyeing, the necessary tasks of maintaining her small household woven among the work of her craft. Each day brought small variations, yet each maintained the essential rhythm that gave shape to her life. Some days brought visitors like Yuki, and Hana would pause to share tea and quiet conversation. Other days passed in solitude, just her and the loom, her and the silk, hours flowing by unmarked except by the gradual progress of her work. One morning, she noticed that the cloth on her loom was nearly complete. Only a few more inches remained to be woven. She felt both satisfaction at the approaching completion and a slight reluctance to end this particular project. Each piece carried its own quality, its own relationship between her hands and the materials, and there was always a small sadness in finishing, even as she looked forward to starting something new. She wove the final rows with extra care, ensuring the pattern resolved properly, that the cloth would be complete and balanced. The last pass of the shuttle felt ceremonial somehow, a conclusion to the many hours of focused attention. She secured the final threads, then sat back, looking at the finished cloth stretched before her. The flowing water pattern was clear now, undeniable, beautiful in its subtlety. She had made something that had not existed before, had brought it into being through patience and skill and time. Carefully, she cut the cloth from the loom, her hands steady as she worked. The fabric puddled in her lap, surprisingly heavy with all those threads combined. She folded it reverently, smoothing each fold, creating neat lines and corners. When it was folded completely, she held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its texture, acknowledging the work it represented. She set the finished cloth aside and prepared the loom for her next project. This involved removing the remaining warp threads, cleaning the frame, checking all the moving parts for wear or damage. She found none. The loom was sturdy, well-made, requiring only occasional oiling to keep it functioning smoothly. She applied oil to the treadles and to the beater's hinges, working it in with her fingers until the mechanism moved with effortless ease. Then came the pleasurable task of planning the next piece. She had the newly dyed golden silk, and she also had thread in shades of green that she had prepared weeks earlier. She imagined them together, gold and green, perhaps in a pattern suggesting leaves in sunlight, or maybe something more abstract, simply the interplay of the two colors creating its own visual rhythm. She would need to calculate how much of each color, how to thread the loom, what pattern of treadle movements would create the effect she envisioned. This planning occupied her mind as she prepared her evening meal. Her hands performed the familiar cooking tasks while her thoughts explored possibilities, discarding some ideas, developing others, gradually clarifying the vision. By the time she sat down to eat, she had decided on an approach. Tomorrow she would begin warping the loom with the new threads, a process that would take most of the day but which was essential to good weaving. That night before sleep, she sat for a while with her finished cloth, unfolding it to look at it in the lamplight. The pattern pleased her, understated but clear, the kind of subtle beauty that would reveal itself gradually to anyone who looked closely. She imagined it finding its way into someone's life, bringing them the same quiet pleasure it brought her. Then she folded it again and placed it in her storage chest with the other finished pieces, ready to take to market when she had accumulated several more. She lay down on her futon feeling deeply content, that same emotional baseline that characterized most of her days. The work continued, always another project waiting, another pattern to explore, another conversation between her hands and the materials of her craft. And that was good. That was exactly as it should be. Her nimble fingers relaxed against the quilt as sleep approached, gentle and inevitable as the dawn that would follow this night, bringing another day of purposeful work, of quiet beauty being made one thread at a time. Morning arrived with birdsong filtering through the paper screens. Hana, 27 years old, rose and moved through her waking routine with the same unhurried grace that marked all her actions. The water she splashed on her face was cool, almost cold, awakening her senses gently. She dried her nimble fingers on a hemp cloth, feeling the rough texture against her skin, then dressed in her indigo work robe and tied her hair back with the wooden comb. Today she would begin warping the loom for the new piece, the gold and green cloth she had envisioned. This task required particular care, as the warp threads formed the foundation for everything that would follow. She ate a simple breakfast of rice porridge with pickled vegetables, then made her way to the workshop where the cleaned and oiled loom waited. She had already calculated how many threads she would need, and now she gathered the bobbin, some wound with the golden chrysanthemum-dyed silk, others with the green thread she had prepared earlier. The green had come from indigo mixed with gardenia, creating a color that reminded her of new leaves in early summer. She arranged the bobbins in order on the table beside the loom, creating the sequence that would form her pattern. The warping process began with attaching threads to the back beam of the loom. She tied the first thread with a secure knot, testing it to ensure it would hold under tension. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, neither too tight nor too loose, finding that perfect balance that came from years of experience. The thread stretched from the back beam to the front, spanning the length of the loom, waiting for its companions. She added thread after thread, following the color sequence she had planned. Gold, gold, green, gold, green, green, gold. The pattern built gradually, each thread placed with intention. The work required standing and bending repeatedly, reaching across the loom's frame, maintaining focus on the order and tension of each individual strand. Her body fell into the rhythm of the movements, and she found herself humming that familiar melody, the one her mother had taught her about mountain streams and pine forests. The morning light shifted across the workshop floor as she worked. Dust motes drifted in the sunbeams, visible one moment and gone the next. The scent of the silk filled her nostrils, a clean, slightly sweet smell that she associated with beginnings, with potential waiting to be realized. Occasionally, she paused to roll her shoulders or stretch her back, acknowledging her body's need for movement, then returned to the task. By midday, she had made significant progress. Perhaps 2/3 of the warp threads were in place, creating a curtain of gold and green that caught the light beautifully. She secured her work and prepared a meal of millet mixed with small dried fish and seaweed. The millet was nutty and satisfying. The fish provided salt and savory depth, and the seaweed added a hint of the ocean. She ate slowly, sitting by the window, watching clouds move lazily across the sky. After eating, she rested briefly, lying on her back on the tatami mats with her eyes closed. She could hear the sounds of the neighborhood children playing somewhere down the street, their laughter high and clear. A dog barked twice, then fell silent. Cart wheels rumbled over stone, accompanied by the rhythmic footsteps of whoever pulled the cart. These sounds washed over her without disturbing her rest, familiar elements of daily life in the city. When she returned to the warping, her body felt refreshed, ready for the remaining work. The afternoon passed in the same measured way as the morning. Thread after thread was added to the loom, each one increasing the density of the warp, bringing the foundation closer to completion. Her nimble fingers worked the knots, tested tensions, made tiny adjustments to ensure everything aligned properly. The light through the windows took on the golden quality of late afternoon when she finally tied off the last warp thread. She stepped back to survey her work, feeling satisfaction at seeing the complete warp stretched across the loom. The colors alternated in their planned pattern, creating stripes that would form the background for whatever she wove into them. Tomorrow, she could begin the actual weaving, watching the design emerge as warp and weft came together. But there remained one more task before the loom was fully prepared. She needed to thread each warp strand through its heddle, the small metal loops that would allow her to raise and lower specific threads. This was detailed work requiring good light and steady concentration. She lit her oil lamp even though daylight remained, positioning it to illuminate the heddles clearly. One by one, she took each warp thread and passed it through its corresponding heddle. The metal loops were small, and the thread had to be guided carefully to pass through the eye. Her fingers performed this delicate work with gentle precision, never forcing, always allowing the thread to find its way through. The repetitive nature of the task created its own meditation, and she found her breathing slowing, her awareness narrowing to focus entirely on the work before her. By the time she finished threading all the heddles, evening had settled fully. Her lamp flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, and from outside came the sound of temple bells marking the day's end. She stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in her back and shoulders, the pleasant tiredness that came from a full day of focused work. The loom was ready now, completely prepared for weaving to begin. She prepared a simple evening meal soup made from miso paste, daikon radish, and wakame seaweed. The soup was hot and savory, its warmth spreading through her body with each sip. She ate it with rice that had been cooking slowly over low coals, and she added a few pieces of pickled ginger for contrast. The meal satisfied her completely, providing exactly what her body needed after the day's exertions. After cleaning her dishes, she stepped out into the garden. The evening air was mild, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. The sky had deepened to indigo, and stars were emerging one by one, like tiny fires being lit in the darkness. She walked slowly along the narrow path between her vegetable beds, noting which plants needed attention, which were thriving, which might be ready to harvest soon. The morning glory vines had closed their blossoms for the night, the flowers furled tight until dawn would summon them open again. She touched one gently, feeling the soft texture of the petal, marveling at how such delicate things survived and flourished, opening and closing day after day in their ordained cycle. A cricket began its evening song somewhere in the grass, its rhythmic chirping steady and peaceful. She remained outside until the air grew cool enough to make her shawl necessary. Then she returned inside, banked the fire in the brazier, and prepared for sleep. Her futon felt welcoming as she lay down, the quilt settling over her with familiar weight. Through the screens, she could see the stars, brighter now that full darkness had fallen. The cricket's song continued, joining with other crickets in a chorus that seemed to speak of summer's gradual progression toward autumn. Hana, 27 years old, lay with her nimble fingers resting gently on her stomach, her breathing slow and even. Tomorrow the weaving would begin again, but this time with new colors, a new pattern, a new conversation between thread and thread, between her intentions and the cloth's emerging reality. The thought pleased her not with excitement, but with quiet anticipation, the kind that came from knowing she would engage with work she loved, work that gave shape and meaning to her days. Sleep came gradually, her body relaxing into the futon, her mind releasing its hold on waking thoughts. The cricket's song seemed to grow softer, or perhaps she was simply sinking deeper into rest, moving away from the sounds of the outer world toward the silent stillness of sleep. Her breath grew quieter, her muscles loosened completely, and she drifted into dreams like a leaf floating down a stream, carried gently on currents she did not need to understand or control. The next morning brought scattered clouds and pleasant temperatures. Hana woke feeling rested, her body ready for the day ahead. She performed her morning routine, then made her way to the workshop where the prepared loom waited. The warp threads gleamed in the morning light, their gold and green colors looking fresh and inviting. She settled onto her seat, positioned her feet on the treadles, and reached for the shuttle that held the weft thread she had chosen to begin with gold, matching the predominant color in the warp. The first pass of the shuttle felt ceremonial, the beginning of something new. The weft thread traveled through the shed created by the raised warp threads, making its journey from one side to the other. She caught it with her free hand, then pressed the beater forward, settling the new thread firmly against the loom's starting bar. The motion was familiar yet always slightly novel at the beginning of a new piece, when the cloth was just an idea beginning to take physical form. She continued weaving, falling into the rhythm that her body knew so well. Pass the shuttle through, catch it on the far side, press the beater forward, change which threads were raised by pressing a different treadle, repeat. The movements flowed one into another like water, like breathing, requiring attention but not strain, focus but not tension. Her hands and feet worked in coordination, and gradually the cloth began to grow, row by row, building substance from individual threads. The morning passed in this way, with only the sounds of the loom's workings, the soft thump of the beater, the creak of the treadles, the whisper of thread passing through thread. Outside, life in the city continued its daily patterns, but inside the workshop, time seemed to expand and slow, making room for the patient accumulation of detail that was weaving. Each pass of the shuttle added its small contribution to the whole, and the whole grew visible, achievable, real. When her hands began to tire, she paused and prepared tea. The kettle heated over the brazier while she stood by the window, looking out at the garden. The clouds that had scattered the morning sky were gathering now, building into larger formations that suggested rain might come later. The air had taken on that particular quality it held before rain, a heaviness, a stillness, a sense of anticipation. The leaves on the morning glory vines hung motionless, as if waiting. She drank her tea slowly, appreciating the warmth of the cup against her palms, the slightly bitter flavor that gradually revealed hints of sweetness. The tea leaves had been a gift from a customer some weeks ago, someone who had purchased cloth from her and wanted to express additional gratitude. She had been touched by the gesture, by the recognition that her work brought beauty into someone else's life. Drinking tea from those leaves carried a sense of connection, of being part of a web of relationships that extended beyond her workshop's walls. Returning to the loom, she resumed weaving. The cloth was perhaps 3 inches long now, enough to show the pattern beginning to establish itself. The gold weft thread interacted with the mixed gold and green warp, creating areas of solid color and areas where green peeked through, adding depth and variation. She found herself pleased with the effect. It was subtle, but interesting, exactly the kind of understated beauty she most appreciated. The afternoon brought the anticipated rain. It began as a few drops tapping against the paper screens, then increased to a steady downpour that created a constant, soothing sound. The air cooled noticeably, and Hana wrapped her shawl around her shoulders while she worked. The rain's presence transformed the workshop's atmosphere, making it feel even more like a refuge, a dry and peaceful space while water fell outside. She continued weaving through the rain, her rhythm unbroken by the weather's change. If anything, the rain's steady percussion seemed to complement the loom's sounds, creating a layered soundscape that was almost musical. Her humming joined with these sounds, adding another voice to the symphony, and she felt deeply content. That familiar emotional bass line that characterized most of her days, amplified slightly by the pleasant combination of focused work and rain-washed air. By late afternoon, the rain had diminished to a light drizzle. Hana secured her shuttle and rose from the loom, stretching thoroughly. She had been working steadily for hours, and her body needed movement. She performed a series of gentle stretches, reaching her arms overhead, bending to touch her toes, rotating her shoulders and neck. Each movement felt good, releasing tension, encouraging blood flow, reminding her that she was a body as well as a pair of working hands. She prepared her evening meal. Rice and vegetables steamed together, seasoned with a bit of salt and sesame oil. The vegetables were from her garden, pulled that morning before the rain began. Their flavors were fresh and clean, tasting of earth and sun and water. She ate mindfully, chewing thoroughly, grateful for the nourishment, for the simple pleasure of food grown with her own hands, prepared with care, consumed without hurry. After eating, she stepped out into the garden despite the continuing drizzle. The rain was gentle now, barely more than mist, and she appreciated its cool touch on her face and hands. The garden had transformed under the rain's influence. Everything looked greener, fresher, more vibrant. Water droplets clung to leaves and petals, each one a tiny lens that caught and held light. The earth smelled rich and alive, and she could almost sense the plants drinking deeply, their roots drawing moisture down into the soil's hidden depths. She walked the garden's perimeter slowly, examining each plant, noting how they had responded to the rain's blessing. The radishes had grown noticeably, their leaves spreading wide and healthy. The herbs shiso and mitsuba looked refreshed, their colors deepened. Even the morning glory vines seemed to have put out new growth in just the few hours since the rain began. She felt gratitude for this abundance, for the way the earth provided when given water and sunlight and tending. As darkness settled, she returned inside and lit her lamp. She spent the remaining evening hours preparing more thread for future dyeing, cleaning, and carding raw silk, readying it for the spinning wheel. This work was meditative in its own way, requiring attention but not intense concentration. Her nimble fingers pulled fibers apart, removed impurities, aligned everything so it would spin smoothly when the time came. The raw silk had a rougher texture than finished thread, and working with it made her appreciate the transformation that spinning and dyeing would bring. When her eyes grew tired in the lamplight, she set aside the work and prepared for sleep. The futon welcomed her, and she settled into it with a sigh of comfort. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind freshened air and the sound of water dripping from the eaves, each drop falling at irregular intervals that created their own gentle rhythm. From somewhere in the garden, a frog began to sing a deep, resonant sound that spoke of water and life and the earth's endless cycles. Hana lay listening to the frog's song, feeling her body relax completely into rest. Tomorrow she would return to the loom, and the cloth would grow longer. The pattern would develop further, moving steadily toward completion. But that was tomorrow. For now, she was here in this moment, lying in comfortable darkness, listening to a frog sing its ancient song while stars emerged between the dispersing clouds. Her breathing slowed to match her heartbeat's steady rhythm, and she drifted toward sleep like a boat drifting toward shore. Guided by currents she trusted completely, needing no map, no destination except rest itself. The morning after the rain brought crystalline light, an air so fresh it seemed to carry the essence of growth itself. Hana, 27 years old, woke to the sound of birds celebrating the cleansed world, their songs more varied and enthusiastic than usual. She rose and opened the screens to let in the morning air, feeling its coolness against her skin, breathing deeply of its purity. Her morning routine carried a special pleasure today, each action feeling somehow renewed by the rain's passage. The water she used for washing seemed softer, the rice for breakfast tasted sweeter, even the indigo of her work robe appeared more vivid in the clear light. She moved through these familiar tasks with heightened awareness, noticing small details she might otherwise have overlooked, the way light caught in the water droplets still clinging to the garden plants, the particular texture of the hemp towel against her face, the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. In the workshop, the loom waited with several inches of cloth already woven. She examined yesterday's work in the bright morning light, running her nimble fingers across the surface, checking for any inconsistencies in tension or pattern. Finding none, she settled onto her seat and resumed weaving. The shuttle passed through the shed, the beater pressed forward, the treadles shifted beneath her feet. The rhythm established itself immediately, as natural as walking, as breathing. The cloth grew steadily through the morning hours. She had decided to introduce the green weft thread now, alternating it with the gold to create horizontal stripes that would interact with the vertical pattern of the warp. The color changes required stopping to wind a new shuttle, but this pause felt natural rather than disruptive. She took her time winding the green thread onto the shuttle's bobbin, ensuring it was neither too loose nor too tight, that it would unwind smoothly during weaving. When she resumed with the green thread, the cloth took on new dimension. The areas where green weft crossed green warp created patches of solid color, while places where green weft met gold warp produced a subtle blending, a visual mixing that suggested depth and complexity. She found herself absorbed in watching the pattern emerge, in seeing how her planning translated into actual cloth, into something that could be touched and seen and eventually used. By late morning, a visitor arrived. Hana heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see a young woman she recognized, Tomo, the daughter of a neighboring family who had recently expressed interest in learning to weave. Tomo stood at the doorway with an uncertain expression, clearly hesitant to interrupt. Hana smiled and gestured her inside, setting aside her shuttle. "Good morning, Tomo," she said, her voice warm with welcome. "Please come in." Tomo entered with careful steps, her eyes drawn immediately to the loom and the cloth growing upon it. She was perhaps 18 years old, with an earnest quality that Hana found appealing. "I hope I am not disturbing your work," Tomo said, her words formal with politeness. "Not at all," Hana replied. "Would you like some tea?" They settled by the window, and Hana prepared tea while Tomo watched with quiet attention. The ritual of heating water, measuring leaves, pouring and serving all of it became an informal teaching moment, though Hana said nothing, simply performed each action with the same care she brought to her weaving. Tomo seemed to understand, observing closely, learning through watching. "The cloth is beautiful," Tomo said after they had both sipped their tea. "The way the colors work together, it seems like magic, but I know it is really planning and skill." Hana smiled at this observation. "It is both, perhaps," she said. "There is planning, yes, and technique learned over many years, but there is also something that happens between the weaver and the materials, something that cannot be entirely planned or controlled. The threads have their own nature, and good weaving means working with that nature rather than against it." Tomo nodded thoughtfully, her hands wrapped around her teacup as if drawing warmth from it despite the mild temperature. "I would like to learn this work," she said quietly. "Not just the movements, but the understanding you speak of." "That kind of understanding comes slowly," Hana replied, "through many hours of practice, through mistakes and corrections, through paying attention not just to what your hands are doing, but to what the materials are telling you." She paused, considering. "If you are truly interested, you could come several mornings each week. I would be glad to teach you." Tomo's face brightened with genuine joy. "I would be honored," she said. "When should I begin?" "Tomorrow, if you like," Hana said. "Come when the morning light is strong enough to see clearly. We will start with simple things: preparing thread, understanding the loom's parts, learning basic movements. Weaving cannot be rushed. Each skill must be learned thoroughly before moving to the next." They finished their tea in comfortable silence, both looking toward the loom where the cloth waited, patient and growing. After Tomo departed with expressions of gratitude and excitement, Hana returned to her weaving. But now her mind carried new thoughts alongside the work, considering how to teach, what to show first, how to convey not just technique, but the deeper understanding that made weaving a meditation as much as a craft. The afternoon unfolded in its usual pattern. She wove steadily, pausing occasionally to rest her hands and shoulders, to drink water, to simply sit and let her eyes rest on the garden where everything still glistened from yesterday's rain. The cloth lengthened, the pattern developed, and she felt satisfaction in the visible progress, in the transformation of individual threads into coherent whole. As evening approached, she prepared a meal of soba noodles made from buckwheat flour. She had made the noodles herself several days earlier, hanging them to dry on special racks. Now she cooked them in boiling water until they were tender but still maintained their slight firmness. She rinsed them in cool water, then served them in a simple broth made from dried fish and kelp, garnishing the bowl with sliced green onions from her garden. The noodles were satisfying, their earthy flavor complemented by the savory broth and the sharp freshness of the onions. After eating, she sat in the doorway between her living space and the garden, watching the light fade gradually from the sky. A breeze had picked up, carrying scents from the sea salt and fish and that indefinable smell of vast water. The breeze moved through the garden, rustling leaves, swaying the morning glory vines, bringing coolness as the day's warmth dissipated. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and remained sitting, simply present with the transition from day to night. The first stars appeared while she sat there, tiny points of light emerging from the deepening blue. She had always found something comforting about stars, their constancy, their distance, the way they had looked down on countless generations of weavers before her, and would look down on countless more after she was gone. They made her feel both small and connected, a single thread in an immense pattern that stretched across time and space. When the air grew quite cool, she moved inside and lit her lamp. She spent some time organizing her workspace, preparing it for tomorrow when Tamo would arrive for her first lesson. She gathered materials that would be useful for teaching, samples of thread in various stages of preparation, small tools, a simplified diagram she had once drawn showing how a loom's parts work together. She arranged these items on the side table where they would be easily accessible, where she could show them to Tamo without interrupting the day's regular work. Then she prepared for sleep, unrolling her futon and settling into its familiar comfort. Through the paper screens, she could see the garden rendered in shades of darkness, the plants reduced to silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. The breeze continued, bringing the sound of rustling leaves and the distant, rhythmic sound of waves meeting shore. The ocean was perhaps half a mile away, but on quiet nights like this, its presence could be felt and heard, a reminder of the vast waters that surrounded this island nation. Hana, 27 years old, lay with her nimble fingers resting on her stomach, her breathing slow and even. She thought about Tamo's visit, about the prospect of teaching someone else this craft she loved. It would be good to pass along what she had learned, to help another person discover the meditative quality of weaving, the satisfaction of creating beauty from simple materials. Teaching would deepen her own understanding, explaining things to someone else always did. And it would add a new dimension to her days, a different kind of engagement than the solitary work that filled most of her hours. These thoughts drifted through her mind without urgency or weight, simply present like clouds moving slowly across an open sky. Her body relaxed deeper into the futon, her breath grew quieter, and gradually thought itself began to fade, giving way to the wordless awareness that preceded sleep. The breeze, the distant ocean, the darkness beyond her screens, all of it seemed to blend into a single presence, peaceful and vast, within which she rested like a child cradled in gentle arms. Sleep came as it always did, gradual and complete, and she surrendered to it with trust, knowing she would wake when morning came, knowing the work would be waiting, knowing that life would continue its steady, measured unfolding, day after day, season after season, each moment containing its own particular beauty for those patient enough to notice. The next morning arrived with clarity and warmth. Hana woke, washed, dressed, and ate her simple breakfast, then prepared the workshop for Tamo's arrival. She tidied what little needed tidying, positioned the side table where teaching materials waited, and settled at her loom to begin the day's weaving. She had perhaps 20 minutes of solitary work before she heard Tamo's approaching footsteps, and she used that time to center herself, to move into the focused awareness that weaving required. Tamo arrived exactly when the morning light grew strong enough for clear seeing, just as Hana had suggested. The young woman's face showed both eagerness and nervousness, and Hana recognized that combination, the desire to learn mixed with uncertainty about one's abilities. She had felt exactly that way herself, many years ago, when her own aunt had begun teaching her this craft. "Welcome," Hana said, setting aside her shuttle. "Come, sit here beside me. Before we touch the loom, we will look at thread and understand how it is made." She brought out samples of silk in various stages, raw fiber still containing the gum that bound it, cleaned fiber ready for spinning, spun thread in different thicknesses, thread that had been dyed. She passed each sample to Tamo, encouraging her to touch, to feel the differences, to notice how each stage of preparation changed the material's character. Tamo handled each sample with reverence, her fingers exploring texture, her eyes studying color and form. "Silk begins with the silkworm's cocoon," Hana explained, her voice taking on the patient rhythm of teaching. "The worm spins a single continuous thread, sometimes more than 1,000 feet long, to create its protective shell. We harvest these cocoons, soften the gum that binds the thread, then carefully unwind it. Many threads are combined to create the thickness needed for weaving." Tamo listened with complete attention, asking occasional questions that showed she was truly thinking about what she heard. Hana appreciated this quality, the ability to listen deeply, to wonder, to engage actively with new information rather than simply accepting it passively. It suggested that Tamo would be a good student, patient enough for the slow accumulation of skill that weaving required. They spent the entire morning just on thread, looking at it, touching it, understanding its properties and possibilities. Hana showed how thread could be tested for strength, how to judge if it was properly prepared for dyeing, how to recognize good quality versus poor. They examined the bobbins of golden and green thread currently on the loom, and Hana explained how she had achieved those particular colors, what plants had been used, what mordants had helped the dye bind to the fiber. By noon, when Hana suggested they break for a meal, Tamo's mind seemed full to brimming with new information. They ate together rice and vegetables that Hana had prepared, shared between them in comfortable companionship. Tamo asked questions between bites, and Hana answered patiently, often demonstrating with gestures what words alone could not convey. After eating, they turned to the loom itself. Hana explained each part: the frame that held everything in place, the beams that stored the warp threads, the heddles that raised and lowered specific threads, the treadles that controlled the heddles, the shuttle that carried weft thread through the raised threads, the beater that pressed each new thread firmly against those already woven. It was much information for one day, but Tamo absorbed it all with focused attention, occasionally touching parts of the loom gently, as if making friends with them. "Now watch," Hana said, settling onto her seat. "I will weave slowly so you can see each movement clearly. She demonstrated the complete sequence, pressing a treadle to raise certain warp threads, passing the shuttle through the created opening, catching it on the far side, bringing the beater forward to press the new weft thread into place, then pressing a different treadle to create a new opening for the shuttle's return journey. She performed these movements with exaggerated slowness, allowing Tamo to see every detail, every small adjustment of hand and foot. Tamo watched with unwavering focus, her eyes tracking each movement, her body subtly mirroring some of the motions as if already trying to understand them through muscle memory. When Hana had completed several full cycles, she invited Tamo to try. The young woman approached the loom with visible nervousness, settling onto the seat with tentative care. "Do not worry about making mistakes," Hana said gently. "Everyone makes mistakes when learning. The loom will not break, the thread will not be ruined. Just try the movements and see how they feel." Tamo pressed a treadle and the heddles rose as they should. Her face brightened with small triumph at this success. She picked up the shuttle, but her grip was awkward, uncertain. Hana adjusted her hold gently, showing how the shuttle could rest naturally in the hand, how it could be thrown through the shed with minimal effort. Tamo tried again, and this time the shuttle passed through, though it nearly dropped when she tried to catch it on the far side. They worked like this through the afternoon, Tamo attempting movements, Hana offering gentle corrections and encouragement, both of them focused entirely on the learning process. Progress was slow, as Hana had known it would be, but that was appropriate. Mastery could not be rushed. Each small success needed to be built upon, each mistake needed to be understood and corrected, until gradually the movements became natural, automatic, part of muscle memory rather than conscious thought. By late afternoon, Tamo could complete the full weaving sequence, though slowly and with visible concentration. Her face glowed with pride and exhaustion in equal measure. "It is much harder than it looks when you do it," she said, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "That is always true of skilled work," Hana replied, smiling. "What looks effortless is usually the result of hundreds or thousands of hours of practice. But you have done well today. You have learned much, and you have the right attitude, patient, willing to make mistakes, not expecting immediate mastery." Tamo thanked her with deep sincerity, bowing formally before she departed. After the young woman had gone, Hana returned to her own weaving, making up for the time spent teaching. Her hands moved with their customary fluidity. The cloth grew steadily, and she found herself feeling pleased with the day despite its departure from her usual routine. Teaching had brought its own kind of satisfaction, different from but complementary to the satisfaction of solitary work. As evening settled, she prepared a simple meal and ate while watching the garden fade into dusk. The sky took on the colors of ripe plums, deep purple, soft red, hints of gold where the sun had recently set. Birds sang their evening songs, intricate melodies that seemed to celebrate the day's passing. A cat appeared in the garden, moving silently through the shadows, pausing occasionally to listen for sounds only it could hear. Hana watched it until it disappeared over the fence, then turned her attention back to her meal. After eating, she spent time updating her internal sense of the cloth's progress. She was perhaps halfway through this piece, with the pattern now fully established and clear. The remaining work would be essentially repetition maintaining consistency, ensuring the pattern continued correctly, bringing the cloth to its intended length. This phase of weaving had its own pleasures, different from the excitement of beginning or the satisfaction of finishing, but valuable nonetheless. There was something meditative about the long middle portion of a project, where the outcome was not yet certain, but the process had become familiar, comfortable, known. She prepared for sleep as darkness completed its claim on the world. The futon welcomed her tired body, and she settled into it with gratitude for rest, for the day's good work, for the prospect of Tamo's return tomorrow or the next day for another lesson. Her nimble fingers relaxed against the quilt, her breathing slowed to its sleeping rhythm, and she drifted into rest with the ease of someone whose days were spent in meaningful labor, whose nights offered genuine restoration. The world outside her screens grew quiet except for the constant whisper of wind in leaves, and within that quiet, she found the deep peace that made sleep not just necessary but welcome, not just a refuge but a natural completion to each day's gentle unfolding. Days flowed into one another like water finding its course. Hana, 27 years old, continued her work at the loom while also teaching Tamo, who arrived each morning with unfailing punctuality and growing confidence. The young woman's hands were becoming more certain, her understanding of the loom's workings deepening from theoretical knowledge into practical skill. Hana watched this transformation with quiet pleasure, seeing in Tamo's progress an echo of her own long-ago learning. This particular morning brought mist again, the same soft gray veil that occasionally wrapped the city in hushed mystery. Hana performed her morning routine, then settled at her loom to weave until Tamo arrived. The cloth had grown substantially now, perhaps 2/3 complete, and the full pattern was clearly visible, the interplay of gold and green, creating a visual rhythm that suggested leaves moving in dappled sunlight. She ran her nimble fingers across the woven surface, feeling satisfaction at its evenness, at how well her planning had translated into reality. Tamo arrived as the mist began to thin, her hair slightly dampened by its moisture. She greeted Hana with a respectful bow, then immediately moved to examine the cloth on the loom, her eyes tracing the pattern with evident appreciation. "It has grown so much since yesterday," she said. "The pattern is even more beautiful than I imagined it would be." "Patterns often surprise us as they develop," Hana replied. "What exists in the mind is only a suggestion of what will exist in the cloth. The materials themselves contribute to the final result, the way light catches on silk, the slight variations in thread thickness, even the tension of the weaving. All these things add nuances that cannot be entirely predicted." They worked together through the morning, with Tamo practicing on a smaller teaching loom that Hana had set up for this purpose. The teaching loom was simpler than Hana's main loom, with fewer treadles and a less complex pattern, but it allowed Tamo to build skill without the pressure of working on an actual piece meant for sale or use. The young woman's shuttle passed back and forth, her movements growing steadily more fluid, more confident. Hana watched periodically, offering suggestions when appropriate but mostly allowing Tamo to find her own rhythm, her own relationship with the materials and tools. At midday, They paused for tea, and the simple meal Hana had prepared rice mixed with azuki beans and pickled cucumbers from the garden. They ate in companionable silence, both tired in the pleasant way that came from focused work, both content to rest minds as well as bodies. Through the window, they could see that the mist had cleared completely, revealing a sky of pale blue scattered with small clouds that drifted lazily from east to west. "May I ask something?" Tomo said after they had finished eating and were sipping the last of their tea. "Of course," Hana replied, turning her full attention to the young woman. "When you weave, you hum sometimes, always the same melody. Does it help the work somehow?" Hana smiled, surprised by the question but pleased by Tomo's observation. "My mother taught me that melody when I was very young," she said. "She said it was about mountain streams and pine forests, places of tranquility and continuous flow. When I hum it while weaving, it helps me maintain steady rhythm. The melody has a pace that matches good weaving, not rushed, not dragging, just steady and even. After so many years, humming and weaving have become connected in my body. One calls forth the other." Tomo nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps I will find my own melody someday," she said. "Something that helps me remember to stay steady, to not rush." "You will," Hana assured her. "Or perhaps you will adopt a different way of maintaining rhythm, breathing in a particular pattern, or counting silently, or simply listening to the loom sounds. Each weaver finds what works for them. There is no single correct way." They returned to their respective looms, and the afternoon passed in productive work. The only sounds were the looms themselves, the soft thump of beaters, the creak of treadles, the whisper of thread passing through thread. Occasionally, Hana would rise to check Tomo's progress, offering a word of encouragement or a gentle correction, then return to her own weaving. This pattern felt good, balanced time for teaching and time for personal work, engagement with another person and engagement with solitary craft. By late afternoon, Tomo's hands showed the first signs of real fatigue. Hana noticed the young woman rubbing her fingers, flexing them to ease their stiffness. "That is enough for today," she said kindly. "Your hands are not yet accustomed to this work. They need time to build strength and endurance. If you push too hard too soon, you risk injury." Tomo nodded, though Hana could see she was reluctant to stop. The young woman had the eager quality of all new learners, wanting to practice constantly to achieve mastery quickly. But Hana knew that weaving, like most crafts, required patience with the work, with the materials, and most importantly, with oneself. Skills developed gradually, through consistent practice over time, not through marathon sessions that left hands cramped and spirits exhausted. After Tomo departed, Hana returned to her own loom and wove through the remaining hours of daylight. The cloth was nearing completion now, perhaps only a few more inches remaining. She could feel the approaching end of this particular project, that mixture of satisfaction and slight reluctance that always accompanied finishing. Soon she would cut this cloth from the loom, fold it carefully, add it to her collection of completed pieces. And then she would begin planning the next project, considering colors and patterns, preparing materials, starting the cycle again. As evening approached, she secured her work and prepared her meal fish grilled with a touch of salt, daikon radish cut into thin slices, and rice that had steamed slowly until each grain was tender and perfect. She ate while watching the light fade from the garden, while listening to the evening sounds, birds settling into their roosting places, insects beginning their night songs, the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the neighborhood. These sounds formed a familiar soundtrack to her evenings, reassuring in their predictability. After eating, she spent time in the garden, tending to plants that needed attention. The radishes were ready for harvest, and she pulled several, shaking soil from their white roots before setting them in her basket. The herbs needed trimming, and she used small shears to cut back growth that had become leggy, gathering the fragrant leaves to dry for later use in cooking or medicine. The morning glory vines had begun to show signs of approaching their seasons, and some leaves yellowing, fewer blossoms opening each day. Soon she would need to clear them away and plant something suitable for autumn. The work of gardening had its own meditative quality, similar to weaving but engaging different parts of her body and mind. Her hands worked in soil rather than with thread, dealt with living plants rather than processed fiber, yet the fundamental requirement remained the same: patient attention, respect for materials, willingness to work with natural processes rather than against them. She found satisfaction in both kinds of work and appreciated how they complemented each other, how the garden provided fresh air and physical movement that balanced the indoor stillness of weaving. As darkness settled completely, she returned inside and lit her lamp. She spent the evening preparing thread for dyeing several hanks of white silk that she planned to dye with indigo. The indigo process was complex, requiring multiple dippings and careful attention to temperature and timing, but it produced colors ranging from pale sky blue to deep navy, depending on how many times the thread was immersed. She had been planning this dyeing session for several days, gathering materials, preparing the indigo vat, ensuring everything was ready. Tomorrow, if the weather remained fair, she would begin the dyeing process. It would occupy most of the day, but Tamo would be there to help, which would make the work go more smoothly and would teach the young woman another essential aspect of the weaver's craft. Hana found herself looking forward to it, the particular pleasure of seeing white thread transformed by color, the shared work with Tamo, the different rhythm that dyeing brought compared to weaving's steady repetition. She prepared for sleep, feeling pleasantly tired, her body ready for rest after the day's varied activities. The futon welcomed her, and she settled into it with a long, slow exhale. Through the paper screens, stars were visible in a clear sky, their light steady and ancient. She thought about the cloth nearly finished on her loom, about Tamo's growing skills, about tomorrow's dyeing session. These thoughts drifted through her mind like clouds moving across that star-filled sky, present but not demanding, observed but not clung to. Her nimble fingers relaxed against the quilt, her breathing slowed to its sleeping rhythm, and gradually thought itself dissolved into the wordless awareness that preceded sleep. The night settled around her like a gentle blanket. The house creaked softly as temperatures dropped, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the ocean's constant conversation with the shore. Within this web of quiet sounds, she rested completely, her body releasing the day's exertions, her mind releasing the day's concerns, both prepared for the restoration that sleep would bring. Morning arrived with clear light and pleasant temperatures, perfect conditions for outdoor work. Hana, 27 years old, woke and moved through her routine with the same measured care she brought to everything. She ate a simple breakfast, then began preparing the indigo vat in the garden. The vat was large and heavy, made of clay, and set on a base of stones. She had built up the indigo mixture over several days, combining indigo leaves that had been composted and fermented with water and lime, creating a living dye bath that needed careful tending to maintain its potency. She stirred the vat slowly, using a long wooden paddle to agitate the liquid without introducing too many bubbles. The surface of the dye bath looked unremarkable, a muddy brown color that gave no hint of the brilliant blue it would produce. But when she lifted the paddle and watched the liquid drip back into the vat, she could see the characteristic flower bloom, the blue-green foam that indicated the dye was ready for use. Satisfied, she covered the vat again and went inside to gather the hanks of white silk she had prepared. Tamo arrived as Hana was bringing the silk out to the garden. The young woman's eyes widened at the sight of the vat. "That is where the blue comes from?" she asked, clearly surprised by the unpromising appearance of the liquid. "Yes," Hana said, smiling at Tamo's expression. "Indigo is one of the great mysteries of dyeing. The color is not visible in the dye bath, it only appears when the dyed material meets the air. You will see shortly." She demonstrated the process, taking one hank of silk and slowly lowering it into the vat. The silk disappeared into the brown liquid, and she moved it gently through the dye bath, ensuring every thread was saturated. After several minutes, she lifted it out, and both women watched as the miracle occurred. The threads, which looked greenish-yellow when they first emerged, began to turn blue as oxygen from the air reacted with the dye molecules. The transformation happened gradually but visibly, the color deepening from pale aqua to a beautiful clear blue. Tamo gasped with delight. "It is like magic," she said, echoing her words from their first meeting, but with even more wonder now that she was witnessing the transformation directly. "It does seem magical," Hana agreed, hanging the dyed hank on a line she had strung between two posts. "But it is chemistry, the interaction of substances according to natural laws. Understanding those laws does not diminish the wonder. If anything, it increases it." They worked together through the morning, dyeing hank after hank of silk. The process required patience. Each immersion in the dye bath needed time to penetrate the fiber, and rushing produced uneven results. Between dyeings, they would wait, allowing the vat to rest, and during these waiting periods, Hana explained the history and chemistry of indigo dyeing, how the technique had been practiced for thousands of years, how different cultures had developed their own variations on the basic process. Tamo absorbed this information eagerly, asking questions that showed she was thinking deeply about what she learned. Her hands grew more confident with each hank she dyed, her movements more efficient yet still careful. Hana watched her work and felt satisfaction in seeing skills transfer from teacher to student, in knowing that this ancient craft would continue into another generation through Tamo's learning. By midday, they had dyed all the prepared silk once. The hanks hung on the line, swaying gently in the breeze, their blue color vivid against the green of the garden. But Hana planned to dye them again, building up deeper color through multiple immersions. "Indigo is patient," she explained to Tamo. Each dyeing adds layers, and the final color depends on how many times the silk visits the vat. One immersion gives pale blue, 2 gives medium blue, 3 or 4 gives deep blue, and 5 or more can approach navy or even near black. They paused for a meal and rest, sitting in the shade of a small plum tree that grew at the garden's edge. The tree was old, its trunk gnarled and twisted, but it still produced fruit each spring and provided welcome shade in summer. Hana had hung a simple cloth canopy between its branches, creating a pleasant outdoor room where she could sit and work on warm days. They ate their rice and vegetables in this shaded space, grateful for the coolness, for the breeze that occasionally stirred the air. After eating, they resumed the dyeing, this time re-immersing each hank for a second layer of color. The process was the same: slow lowering into the vat, gentle movement through the liquid, careful lifting, and hanging, but the results were different. The second dyeing produced richer color, deeper blue with more complexity and depth. Tomo marveled at the difference, comparing hanks that had been dyed once with those that had been dyed twice, seeing how much variation could be achieved through this simple process of repetition. The afternoon passed in this rhythm of work and waiting, activity and rest. The garden filled with blue silk hanging on lines, like captured pieces of sky, like fragments of summer heaven brought down to earth. The sight was beautiful in its own right, beyond the practical goal of creating dyed thread. Hana paused occasionally just to look, to appreciate the visual poetry of all that blue against green foliage, to feel gratitude for the opportunity to work with such beautiful materials, to create things of use and beauty. By late afternoon, when the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the dyeing was complete. All the silk had received 2 immersions, and the color was exactly what Hana had envisioned: a clear, strong blue that would work beautifully in future weaving projects. She and Tomo spent the remaining daylight hours rinsing the dyed silk in clean water to remove excess dye and to set the color more permanently. The rinse water turned blue, but gradually less so with each change of water, until finally it ran nearly clear, indicating the process was complete. They hung the rinsed silk to dry overnight, and Tomo prepared to depart. The young woman's hands and forearms were stained blue from the work, and her clothes bore spots and splashes of indigo. She looked tired but deeply satisfied, her face glowing with the pleasure of having participated in something beautiful and ancient. "Thank you for teaching me this," she said to Hana, bowing with genuine gratitude. "I will remember this day always." After Tomo left, Hana cleaned the workspace, covered the indigo vat to protect it from debris, and carried tools inside. Her own hands were stained blue as well, and she knew from experience that the color would gradually fade over several days of washing. She had always rather liked having blue-stained hands. They were a badge of the craft, a visible reminder of work done with care and skill. She prepared a simple evening meal and ate while watching the sun set. The sky blazed with color orange, pink, deep red, and the drying silk caught these colors and seemed to glow from within. Tomorrow the cloth on her loom would be finished, and she would begin planning the next project, perhaps incorporating some of this newly dyed blue thread. The thought pleased her. Working with color she had created herself always added extra satisfaction to the weaving. As darkness settled, she sat for a time in the garden, listening to the evening sounds, feeling the day's pleasant tiredness in her muscles. The work of dyeing engaged the body differently than weaving, more standing, more bending, more movement overall. Her legs and back felt the exertion, and she knew a good night's sleep would restore her completely. The stars emerged one by one, and she watched them appear, marking their familiar patterns, finding comfort in their constancy. When the air grew cool, she went inside and prepared for sleep. The futon welcomed her tired body, and she settled into it with deep gratitude for rest, for the day's good work, for the beauty that had been created. Her nimble fingers, stained blue and slightly wrinkled from water, relaxed against the quilt. Her breathing slowed to match her heartbeat's steady rhythm, and she drifted toward sleep like silk sinking slowly through dye bath, descending gently into blue depths, into the restoration and peace that waited there, infinite and complete. The next morning dawned with soft golden light that made everything it touched seem precious. Hana, 27 years old, woke to find the garden transformed by this light. The blue silk hanging on the lines glowed like pieces of summer sky, and the leaves of her plants seemed to catch and hold each ray. She performed her morning routine, then went outside to check the dyed thread. It was completely dry now, the color set and stable, ready to be wound onto bobbins for future use. She brought the silk inside carefully, handling each hank with reverence. The thread had a slightly different texture after dyeing, softer somehow, more supple. She hung the hanks on pegs along one wall of her workshop, creating a display of graduated blues that pleased her eye. Later she would wind them onto bobbins, but for now she simply wanted to look at them, to appreciate the results of yesterday's work. At her loom, the gold and green cloth waited for its final inches of weaving. She settled onto her seat and took up the shuttle, feeling her body remember the position, her feet finding the treadles without conscious thought. The weaving resumed with its familiar rhythm, and she found herself humming that melody her mother had taught her, the one about mountain streams and pine forests. Her nimble fingers guided the shuttle, and the cloth grew steadily toward completion. Tomo arrived mid-morning, her hands still showing faint blue stains from yesterday's dyeing. The young woman had brought a small gift, fresh persimmons from a tree in her family's garden. The fruit was ripe and perfect, its orange skin smooth and unblemished. Hana accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, thanking Tomo and setting the persimmons on a plate near the window where their color caught the light beautifully. They worked together through the morning, Tomo at the teaching loom and Hana at her main loom. The workshop held a peaceful quality, both women focused on their tasks, the only sounds the soft rhythms of the looms. Occasionally, Tomo would ask a question or Hana would offer a suggestion, but mostly they worked in companionable silence, each absorbed in the meditation that weaving provided. By noon, Hana completed the final row of her cloth. She secured the last thread and sat back, looking at the finished piece with satisfaction. The pattern had resolved perfectly. The colors worked together just as she had envisioned, and the overall quality was excellent, even tension throughout, clean edges, no mistakes or inconsistencies. She felt that deep contentment that came from bringing a project to completion, from seeing intention fully realized in physical form. She called Tomo over to see the finished cloth, and together they admired it. "It is beautiful," Tomo said quietly, running her fingers along the woven surface with gentle reverence. To think that just days ago this was individual threads, and now it is this something whole and complete and useful. That is the essence of weaving, Hana replied, taking separate elements and bringing them together into unity. The threads cannot fulfill their purpose alone, but woven together, they become something greater than the sum of their parts. They shared the persimmons for their midday meal, along with rice and pickled vegetables. The fruit was sweet and slightly soft, its flavor rich and complex. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for the gift of good food, for the pleasure of eating in company, for the simple satisfaction of nourishing their bodies after focused work. After eating, Hana began the process of cutting the finished cloth from the loom. This required care. She needed to cut the warp threads without damaging the cloth itself, then secure the ends so they would not unravel. She worked slowly and deliberately, using sharp scissors to cut each thread close to the cloth's edge. Tamo watched with careful attention, learning yet another aspect of the weaver's craft. When the cloth was finally free from the loom, Hana spread it on her work table to examine it fully. It measured approximately 2 feet in width and 5 feet in length, a good size for many uses. She would finish the edges by hemming them, but that work could wait for later. For now, she simply wanted to appreciate the completed piece, to mark the moment of its release from the loom into independent existence. She folded the cloth carefully, creating neat lines and corners, then placed it in her storage chest with other finished pieces. The chest held perhaps 8 or 10 cloths now, all waiting for the right time to take to market. She preferred to accumulate several pieces before making the journey to the merchant district where she sold her work. That way the trip felt worthwhile, and she could maintain her preferred rhythm of work without frequent interruptions. With the loom now empty, she turned to the task of planning her next project. She had the newly dyed blue silk, and she also had thread in shades of cream and pale yellow that had been waiting for the right project. She imagined them together, blue and cream, perhaps with touches of yellow for accent. The combination suggested sky and clouds, or maybe water and sand. She would need to weave sample pieces to see which pattern and color arrangement worked best. But those decisions could wait. For the remainder of the afternoon, she helped Tamo with her practice weaving. The young woman had made remarkable progress over the past several days, her movements becoming more fluid, her understanding of the loom's mechanics deepening. The practice cloth she was creating showed steady improvement. The early rows were somewhat uneven, but the recent rows showed much better consistency in tension and spacing. "You are learning well," Hana told her, and meant it sincerely. "You have the patience this work requires and the attention to detail. Those qualities are more important than quick hands or natural dexterity. Skills can be learned through practice, but patience and attention must come from within." Tamo's face showed pleasure at this praise, but also humility. "I have much to learn still," she said. "When I watch you weave, everything looks so effortless, so natural. My work still requires so much concentration, so much conscious thought about each movement." "That is exactly as it should be at this stage," Hana assured her. "Conscious thought is how we learn. Only after thousands of repetitions do the movements become automatic, part of muscle memory rather than deliberate action." You are exactly where you need to be in your learning. Trust the process, continue practicing, and one day you will realize that your hands know the work without your mind needing to direct them. As evening approached, Tomo prepared to leave. Hana walked with her to the door, and they stood for a moment looking out at the garden where long shadows stretched across the ground. The light had that particular quality of late afternoon golden and somehow thickened, making everything it touched seem to glow from within. "Tomorrow I cannot come," Tomo said with evident regret. "My family needs my help with other tasks, but I will return the day after if that is acceptable." "Of course," Hana replied. "Your family's needs must come first. The loom will be here when you return and we will continue then." After Tomo departed, Hana spent the remaining daylight hours in the garden, tending to tasks that had accumulated over recent days. She pulled weeds from between vegetable rows, watered plants that needed moisture, checked for insects that might be damaging her crops. The work was meditative in its own way, engaging her body while allowing her mind to rest in simple awareness of earth and growing things. The radishes she had planted several weeks ago were thriving, their leaves broad and healthy. She pulled one to check its development and found the root was ready for harvest, white and crisp and perfectly formed. She gathered several more, filling her basket with enough for meals over the next few days. The herbs were also flourishing, and she harvested some shiso leaves and a few stems of mitsuba, their fragrances sharp and clean in the evening air. As dusk settled, she prepared her evening meal using some of the just harvested vegetables. She made soup with miso paste, daikon radish, and tofu, its savory aroma filling the kitchen as it simmered. She served this with rice and the harvested shiso leaves, which she ate whole, appreciating their distinctive flavor, slightly minty, slightly spicy, completely unique. The meal nourished her thoroughly, and she ate with gratitude for the garden's abundance, for her own skills in cultivation and preparation. After cleaning her dishes, she sat in the doorway between her living space and the garden, watching night complete its claim on the world. The sky deepened through shades of blue from pale azure to rich cobalt to finally the deep indigo that preceded full darkness. Stars emerged in their ordained patterns, and a thin crescent moon hung low in the west, its delicate curve like a smile or a silver bow. She thought about the empty loom waiting in her workshop, ready for a new project. Tomorrow she would begin preparing the warp for the blue and cream cloth she had envisioned. The work would take most of the day, calculating thread counts, arranging colors in sequence, stretching and securing everything properly. It was detailed work that required focus, but she looked forward to it. Each new project brought its own excitement, its own possibilities and challenges. The air grew cool, and she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, but she remained sitting, reluctant to end this peaceful transition between day and night. A bat flew past, its erratic flight pattern briefly silhouetted against the darkening sky. From somewhere in the neighborhood came the sound of a shamisen being played, its distinctive plucked notes carrying through the quiet air. The melody was unfamiliar to her, but beautiful melancholy without being sad, contemplative without being heavy. When the music ended and the night grew fully dark, she finally moved inside and lit her lamp. She spent a short time preparing thread for tomorrow's warping, laying out the bobbins she would need in the order she would use them. This advanced preparation would make the next day's work flow more smoothly, reducing the need to stop and search for materials. Her nimble fingers moved among the bobbins, arranging them just so, and she felt satisfaction in this small organizing task, this preparation for future creation. She prepared for sleep feeling peaceful and complete, ready for rest after a day of varied activities. The futon welcomed her as it did every night, and she settled into its familiar comfort with a long, slow exhale. Through the paper screens, she could see stars scattered across the darkness, their ancient light traveling unimaginable distances to reach her eyes. The thought made her feel both infinitely small and somehow connected to vast patterns beyond her comprehension. Hana, 27 years old, lay with her nimble fingers resting on her stomach, her breathing slow and even. Tomorrow would bring new work warping the loom, beginning another cloth, continuing the endless cycle of creation that gave shape and meaning to her days. But that was tomorrow. For now, she was here in this moment, lying in comfortable darkness, feeling her body relax into rest, her mind releasing its hold on waking thoughts. Sleep approached gradually, gentle as fog rolling in from the sea. Her awareness grew softer, more diffuse, less bounded by the usual sharp edges of consciousness. The night held her like water holds a floating leaf, supporting without effort, requiring no action or resistance. And she surrendered to it completely, trusting in sleep's restoration, knowing she would wake when morning came, knowing the work would be waiting, knowing that life would continue its steady, measured unfolding, each day bringing its own particular gifts, its own quiet beauties, its own simple satisfactions that made the living of it worthwhile. The following morning arrived with scattered clouds and comfortable temperatures. Hana woke and moved through her routine, then made her way to the workshop to begin preparing the loom for her next project. She gathered the bobbins she had arranged the previous evening blues in varying shades, creams ranging from pale ivory to rich butter color, and touches of soft yellow for accent. She had decided to create a pattern suggesting waves meeting shore, with the blues representing water and the creams and yellows representing sand and foam. The warping process began as it always did, with careful calculation. She needed to determine how many threads of each color, in what sequence, to create the effect she envisioned. She made small sketches on a piece of paper, working out the pattern mathematically before committing threads to the loom. This planning phase was important. Mistakes made here would carry through the entire cloth, so it was worth taking time to ensure everything was correct. Once satisfied with her plan, she began attaching threads to the loom's back beam. Blue, blue, cream, blue, cream, 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 blue. The sequence built gradually, each thread placed according to her design. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, and she found herself humming that familiar melody, its steady rhythm helping her maintain consistent packing. The morning passed in this focused work, and by midday she had completed perhaps half the warping. She paused for a meal of rice and miso soup, adding some of the radishes she had harvested the previous evening. The radishes were crisp and slightly peppery, their flavor refreshing. She ate sitting by the window, looking out at the garden where clouds cast moving shadows across the ground. The shifting light created an ever-changing display, and she watched it idly while she ate, her mind resting from the concentration that warping required. After eating, she returned to the loom and continued the warping process. Thread after thread was added, the curtain of blue and cream growing denser, the pattern becoming visible. She worked steadily through the afternoon, pausing occasionally to rest her hands or stretch her back, but mostly maintaining continuous focus. The work had its own momentum, and she rode that momentum like a leaf riding a current, allowing it to carry her forward without force or struggle. By evening, the warping was complete. She stood back to survey her work, checking that all threads were properly tensioned, that the color sequence matched her plan, that everything was ready for weaving to begin. Satisfied, she covered the loom with its hemp cloth and turned to other tasks. Tomorrow she would thread the heddle's detailed work that required good light and steady concentration. But for now, the day's primary task was finished. She prepared a simple evening meal and ate while watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of coral and lavender. The clouds that had scattered the day now gathered the sun's colors and seemed to hold them, glowing from within like paper lanterns. She watched until the colors faded to gray and then to darkness, marking the day's end with this quiet observation, this simple witnessing of natural beauty. As night settled, she sat with her finished cloth, the gold and green piece she had completed earlier, and examined it by lamplight. She would hem the edges tomorrow, giving it finished borders that would prevent unraveling. The work was straightforward but required care, ensuring the stitches were even and small, nearly invisible against the cloth itself. She looked forward to this finishing work, to the satisfaction of making something complete in every detail. She prepared for sleep, feeling the pleasant tiredness that came from a full day of productive work. Her futon welcomed her, and she settled into it with gratitude. Through the screens, stars shone in a clear sky, their light steady and constant. She watched them for a time, her nimble fingers relaxed against the quilt, her breathing slow and even. Tomorrow would bring more work, more creation, more of the steady rhythm that characterized her days. And that was good. That was exactly as it should be. Within this knowledge, this acceptance, she found deep peace, and sleep came gently, inevitably, like waves lapping at the shore, each one a little closer, until finally consciousness dissolved into rest, complete and restoring. The morning arrived with birdsong, and the scent of damp earth rain had fallen during the night, soft and brief, leaving everything refreshed. Hana, 27 years old, woke to this cleansed world and performed her morning routine with the same unhurried grace she brought to all things. She dressed in her indigo work robe, the fabric soft against her skin from countless washings, and tied her hair back with the wooden comb that had belonged to her aunt. After eating a simple breakfast of rice porridge with pickled plum, she settled at her work table with the gold and green cloth she had completed days earlier. Today she would hem the edges, giving the piece its final finishing. She threaded a needle with silk thread that matched the cloth's predominant color, knotting it securely. Then she folded the raw edge of the cloth inward, creating a narrow hem, and began stitching with small, even movements. The hemming work required different attention than weaving, closer focus on tiny details, precise placement of each stitch, ensuring consistency across the entire length of cloth. Her nimble fingers guided the needle through the fabric, creating stitches so small they were barely visible. She worked slowly and deliberately, refusing to rush despite the repetitive nature of the task. Each stitch deserved the same care as the first, the same attention that would make the finished edge both strong and beautiful. The morning light shifted across her work table as she sewed, and she adjusted her position occasionally to keep the best light on her stitching. Outside, she could hear the neighborhood coming to life, doors sliding open, footsteps on stone paths, voices calling greetings. These sounds formed a backdrop to her work, familiar and comforting, connecting her to the community beyond her workshop walls while she remained focused on the task before her. By mid-morning, she had completed one long edge of the cloth. She paused to rest her eyes and prepare tea, heating water over the brazier while she stood by the window. The garden glistened with moisture from the night's rain, and everything looked intensely green and alive. A small brown bird hopped along the ground, searching for insects disturbed by the rain. She watched it until it flew away, then returned to her tea preparation. The tea was hot and slightly bitter, warming her from within as she drank. She cupped her hands around the ceramic vessel, appreciating its heat, its weight, the way it fit perfectly in her palms. These small pleasures, warm tea, good light, the satisfaction of work progressing well filled her days with quiet contentment. She needed nothing dramatic or exciting to feel that life was good. The ordinary, when approached with full attention, revealed itself as extraordinary. She returned to her hemming and worked through the remainder of the morning, completing a second edge and beginning the third. The stitches marched along the cloth's border like tiny footprints, each one contributing to the whole. Her hand moved with steady rhythm, and she found herself humming that melody her mother had taught her, the sound soft and slightly husky in the quiet workshop. At midday, Tomo returned as promised, arriving with a basket containing fresh greens from her family's garden. The young woman looked rested and eager to resume her learning. Her hands had lost their blue stains from the dyeing work, and she wore a simple work robe similar to Hana's, suitable for the day's activities. "Welcome back," Hana said warmly, setting aside her hemming. "I am glad you are here. Today I thought we might work on threading Heddle's detailed work, but essential to understand." She showed Tomo the newly warped loom with its curtain of blue and cream threads, explaining how each thread needed to pass through a Heddle before weaving could begin. The Heddles were small metal loops with eyes through which the threads passed, and each one needed to be threaded individually. It was painstaking work, but it allowed the weaver to control which threads raised and lowered during weaving, creating the patterns and textures that distinguished cloth from simple fabric. They worked side by side, Tomo at the teaching loom and Hana at her main loom. Hana demonstrated the threading process, showing how to guide the thread through the small opening without forcing, how to check that each thread passed through correctly before moving to the next. Tomo practiced on her simpler loom, her young eyes and nimble fingers well suited to the detailed work. The afternoon passed in focused concentration, both women absorbed in their tasks. Occasionally, Hana would check Tomo's progress, offering encouragement or gentle correction, but mostly they worked in companionable silence. The only sounds were their breathing, the small rustles of thread being handled, and the distant sounds from outside cart wheels on stone, children playing somewhere down the street, the rhythmic thump of someone beating cloth to soften it. By late afternoon, Hana had completed threading all the heddles on her loom. She tested the mechanism, pressing treadles to raise and lower different combinations of threads, ensuring everything worked smoothly. The heddles lifted and fell exactly as they should, creating clean sheds through which the shuttle would pass. The loom was fully prepared now, ready for weaving to begin tomorrow. Tomo had also made good progress, though her smaller practice loom required fewer heddles to thread. Her work was careful and accurate, showing the attention to detail that Hana had recognized in her from the beginning. "You have done excellent work today," Hana told her. "Threading heddles tests patience and precision, and you have shown both." Tomo's face brightened at this praise. "Thank you," she said. "I find I enjoy this detailed work. It requires such focus that my mind becomes very quiet, very still. All other thoughts fall away, and there is only the thread and the heddle and the moment of passing one through the other." Hana smiled, recognizing in these words the same experience she had discovered years ago. "That is the meditation within craft," she said. "When we give our full attention to the task at hand, everything else recedes. We become present completely, and in that presence we find peace. This is one of the great gifts that weaving offers, not just the cloth we create, but the state of mind we enter while creating it." They shared the greens Tomo had brought, adding them to rice and miso soup that Hana prepared. The greens were tender and flavorful, slightly bitter in a way that complemented the soup's savory depth. They ate together in the pleasant tiredness that came from sustained concentration, both grateful for food and rest and companionship. After Tomo departed, Hana returned to her hemming work. She completed the third edge as the light began to fade, then started on the fourth and final edge. This was the last stage of finishing, and she wanted to complete it before darkness fell. Her hands moved steadily, the needle rising and falling in its rhythmic pattern, the stitches accumulating like grains of rice filling a bowl slowly but surely, each one necessary, none skipped or rushed. As the sun touched the horizon, she placed the final stitch and knotted her thread securely. The hemming was complete. She held up the finished cloth, examining it in the fading light. All 4 edges were neatly finished, the stitches even and nearly invisible, the corners square and crisp. The cloth was ready now for whatever use would claim it, perhaps as part of a garment, perhaps as a decorative hanging, perhaps for some purpose she could not yet imagine. She folded the cloth carefully and returned it to her storage chest, satisfied with the completion. Tomorrow she would begin weaving the new blue and cream piece, starting another cycle of creation. But for now, this piece was done, released from her hands into its own existence, carrying with it all the care and attention she had invested in its making. She prepared a simple evening meal and ate while watching the last light drain from the sky. The day had been productive and peaceful, filled with the kind of work that brought both outer results and inner satisfaction. Her hands showed the day's activities, the small indentation on her finger where the needle had pressed repeatedly, the slight stiffness from hours of fine motor control. She flexed her nimble fingers, acknowledging their tiredness, grateful for their service. After eating, she stepped into the garden as evening settled. The air was mild and still, carrying the earthy scent that lingered after rain. Everything felt fresh and renewed, as if the world itself had been washed clean. She walked slowly along the garden paths, checking on plants, nodding which needed attention, which were flourishing. The evening light made everything look soft and slightly unreal, like a scene painted on silk. The morning glory vines were showing more signs of their season, ending, fewer blooms opening each day, more leaves yellowing and dropping. Soon she would need to remove them and prepare the trellis for autumn plantings. The cycle continued, endlessly planting, growing, harvesting, clearing away, planting again. Each season brought its own tasks, its own beauties, its own particular gifts. She had learned to appreciate them all, to find satisfaction in each phase rather than wishing always for a different season. As darkness gathered, she returned inside and lit her lamp. She spent a short time preparing for tomorrow's weaving, checking that her shuttles were properly wound with thread, that her workspace was organized and ready. These small preparations made the next day's work flow more smoothly, reducing friction and distraction. Her hands moved among the tools and materials with practiced familiarity, everything in its place, everything ready for use. She prepared for sleep feeling deeply content, that familiar emotional baseline that characterized most of her days. The futon welcomed her, and she settled into it with a long exhalation. Through the paper screens, stars were visible in the clear night sky, their patterns unchanged by human concerns or activities. She watched them for a time, her nimble fingers relaxed against the quilt, her breathing slow and even. Tomorrow the new cloth would begin its emergence from the loom, thread by thread, row by row. She looked forward to it with quiet anticipation, not excitement that raised her energy, but peaceful expectation that settled her more deeply into rest. The work would be there when she woke, patient and waiting, ready to receive her attention and care. And she would be there to give it, as she had been for years, as she would be for years to come, weaving beauty into existence one thread at a time, finding meaning and purpose in the steady rhythm of creation. Sleep approached like a gentle tide, gradual and inevitable. Her body relaxed completely into the futon. Her mind released its hold on waking thoughts, and she drifted into rest as naturally as day drifting into night. The stars continued their slow wheel across the darkness. The garden rested in silent growth, and within her small dwelling, Hana rested too, her breathing soft and regular, her face peaceful in sleep, her hands still at last after their day of productive work, waiting for morning to summon them once more to the loom, to the thread, to the endless satisfying cycle of making beauty from simple materials, patience, and care. The next morning brought clear skies and the promise of pleasant temperatures. Hana, 27 years old, woke feeling rested and ready for the day ahead. She performed her morning routine with the same measured attention she gave everything, then made her way to the workshop where the prepared loom waited. The warp threads of blue and cream gleamed in the morning light, and she felt a small thrill of anticipation at beginning this new piece. She settled onto her seat and positioned the first shuttle, which she had wound with pale blue thread. The opening pass of the shuttle felt momentous somehow, the beginning of transformation from plan to reality. The weft thread traveled through the shed created by raised warp threads, and she caught it smoothly on the far side. The beater pressed forward, settling the new thread against the starting bar. The cloth had begun. She continued weaving, establishing the rhythm that her body knew so well. Pass the shuttle through, catch it, press the beater forward, change which threads were raised, repeat. The movements flowed like water, like breathing, requiring focus but not strain. Her nimble fingers guided the work, and her feet pressed the treadles in their ordained pattern. The familiar melody rose to her lips, and she hummed softly while she worked, the sound blending with the loom's gentle percussion. The morning passed in this absorbed state, time seeming to expand and slow. Outside, life continued its daily patterns, but inside the workshop, she inhabited a different realm, one where only thread and pattern and rhythm mattered, where past and future dissolved into the continuous present of creation. Her hands moved, the cloth grew, and she felt completely aligned with her purpose, completely at peace within her work. By late morning, perhaps 2 inches of cloth had accumulated on the loom. Already the pattern was beginning to reveal itself, the way blue weft crossed blue warp created areas of solid color, while blue weft crossing cream warp produced subtle blending. The effect was exactly what she had envisioned, and she felt satisfaction in seeing her planning translate so well into physical reality. She paused to prepare tea and rest her hands, standing by the window to look out at the garden. A butterfly visited the few remaining morning glory blossoms, its wings opening and closing slowly as it fed. She watched until it flew away, then drank her tea slowly, appreciating its warmth and flavor, grateful for this small pause in the work's steady rhythm. When she returned to the loom, her body settled immediately back into position, and the weaving resumed as if it had never stopped. This was one of the pleasures of work done day after day, the way the body remembered, the way skills became embedded so deeply that conscious thought was barely necessary. Her hands knew what to do, her feet knew when to press which treadle, and her awareness could rest in simple presence while the work unfolded. The afternoon brought Tomo, who arrived carrying a small basket with fresh eggs from her family's chickens. The young woman's face showed quiet joy at being back, and she immediately moved to her practice loom to continue the work she had begun. Hana appreciated this quality in Tom, the way she needed no lengthy greetings or social preliminaries, but simply moved into the work as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They worked side by side through the afternoon, each at her own loom, each absorbed in her own creation. The workshop held 2 rhythms, now Hana's faster, more fluid movements, and Tomo's slower, more deliberate pace. Together, these rhythms created a kind of harmony, like 2 voices singing different parts of the same song. Neither spoke much, both content to let the work fill the hours, both finding satisfaction in the gradual accumulation of cloth beneath their hands. As evening approached and the light began its slow fade toward dusk, Tomo secured her work and prepared to leave. She had completed several more inches on her practice cloth, and the improvement in her technique was evident. The recent rows showed much better consistency than earlier ones, and her confidence had grown visibly. "Thank you," she said to Hana, bowing with genuine gratitude. "Each day I understand more, not just about weaving but about patience itself, about the value of slow, steady effort." After Tomo departed, Hana continued weaving for another hour, adding more length to the blue and cream cloth. The pattern was developing beautifully, the suggestion of waves and shore becoming clearer with each passing row. She worked until the fading light made it difficult to see clearly, then secured her shuttle and covered the loom for the night. She prepared her evening meal using one of the eggs Tamo had brought, cooking it gently with rice and vegetables. The egg was fresh and flavorful, its yolk a deep orange yellow that spoke of healthy chickens eating varied diets. She ate slowly, appreciating each element of the meal, feeling gratitude for the abundance that came from gardens and careful tending, from community and shared resources. After eating, she sat in the doorway watching night settle over the garden. The sky deepened through its familiar progression of colors blue to indigo to finally the near black of full night. Stars emerged in their patterns, and a thin moon rose in the east, its light casting faint shadows. The air cooled gradually, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but remained sitting, reluctant to end this peaceful transition. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of temple bells, their deep tones carrying through the still air. She counted them 8 strikes marking the hour. The sound seemed to linger after the final bell, gradually fading into silence. She sat within that silence, her nimble fingers resting in her lap, her breathing slow and even, simply present with the night and its quiet beauty. When the air grew quite cool, she finally moved inside and prepared for sleep. The futon welcomed her as always, and she settled into it with deep satisfaction. Her body was pleasantly tired from the day's work, and she knew sleep would come easily. Through the screens, she could see stars scattered across the darkness, and she watched them while her eyes grew heavy, while consciousness began its slow dissolution into rest. Hana lay with her nimble fingers relaxed against the quilt, her breathing matching the deep rhythm of sleep itself. Tomorrow the cloth would grow longer, the pattern would develop further, and life would continue its steady, satisfying unfolding. Within this knowledge, this acceptance of ongoing creation, she found perfect peace. And sleep came gently, completely, like a door closing softly on the day, opening onto the realm of rest and restoration where all weariness dissolved, where the body renewed itself, where dreams moved like silk threads through the darkness, weaving patterns that would be forgotten upon waking, but which somehow nourished the soul nonetheless, preparing it for another day of patient work, of beauty made manifest, of meaning found in the simplest acts performed with complete attention and care. Days continued their gentle progression, each one bringing the same essential rhythm: waking, working, eating, resting, yet each with its own subtle variations that kept life interesting without disturbing its fundamental peace. Hana, 27 years old, moved through these days with the steady grace that defined her, finding satisfaction in the work's continuity, in the cloth's gradual growth, in the teaching relationship with Tamo that deepened with each passing session. The blue and cream cloth had grown substantially now, perhaps a third complete, and the wave pattern was fully established. She had introduced touches of yellow as planned, using them sparingly to suggest foam on wave crests or sunlight on sand. The effect was subtle but effective, adding visual interest without overwhelming the primary colors. Each morning when she uncovered the loom and saw the previous day's work, she felt renewed appreciation for how the design was unfolding. This particular morning brought autumn's first unmistakable signs. The air carried a different quality, crisper, clearer, with a hint of the coolness that would deepen as the season progressed. Hana noticed it immediately upon waking, and she felt the slight shift in her body's response, the way it prepared instinctively for seasonal change. She chose a heavier robe from her chest, one she had woven herself 2 years earlier from wool dyed with walnut shells, its brown color warm and earthy. After her morning meal, she went to the garden to assess what changes autumn would require. The morning glory vines had clearly reached their endmost, leaves were yellow or brown, and no new blossoms opened. She would need to clear them away soon and prepare the trellis for winter. The vegetables were mostly finishing as well, though the radishes and some hardy greens would continue producing for several more weeks. She made mental notes about what needed harvesting, what needed clearing, what could wait a bit longer. Returning to the workshop, she settled at her loom and resumed weaving. The rhythm established itself immediately, and she found herself grateful once again for this work that required her full presence while also allowing her mind a kind of restful focus. Her nimble fingers guided the shuttle, her feet worked the treadles, and the cloth grew row by row, each addition bringing the whole closer to completion. By mid-morning, Tamo arrived wearing a slightly heavier robe as well, acknowledging the seasonal shift. The young woman had brought chestnuts gathered from a tree near her family's home, their shells still glossy and smooth. "My father thought you might enjoy these," she said, offering them with both hands. "He says they are from the tree his grandfather planted." Hana accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, touched by the gesture, and by the connection it represented 3 generations of a family connected to a single tree, and now that tree's harvest being shared with her. "Please thank your father," she said. "I will roast them this evening and think of his grandfather's wisdom in planting such a generous tree." They worked through the morning, each at her own loom. Tamo's practice cloth was nearing completion, and Hana had been considering what the young woman should weave next. Perhaps something simple but more ambitious than practice work, a cloth intended for actual use, with a basic pattern that would challenge her growing skills without overwhelming them. She would suggest this later, when Tamo's current piece was finished. At midday, they paused for tea and a meal of rice with pickled vegetables. They ate in comfortable silence, both tired in the pleasant way that came from focused work. Through the window, they could see leaves beginning to show autumn colors, touches of yellow and red appearing among the green. The garden was transitioning, releasing summer's abundance and preparing for winter's rest. "The seasons change, but the work continues," Tamo observed, following Hana's gaze to the garden. "There is something comforting in that, knowing that even as the world outside transforms, the loom remains constant, always ready, always offering the same steady rhythm." Hana nodded, pleased by this insight. "Yes," she said, "the external world has its cycles of growth and dormancy, abundance and scarcity, but craft work continues year-round. In winter, when the garden sleeps, we still weave. In summer, when everything grows wild, we still weave. The work grounds us, gives us continuity across all seasons." They returned to their looms, and the afternoon passed in productive focus. Hana completed several more inches of the blue and cream cloth, the wave pattern flowing across its surface with increasing clarity. She found herself deeply satisfied with how this piece was developing. It was exactly what she had envisioned, neither more nor less, a perfect translation from imagination to physical form. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Tomo completed the final rows of her practice cloth. She secured the last thread and sat back, looking at her work with an expression that mixed pride and critical assessment. Hana came to examine it, running her hands across the woven surface, checking tension and consistency. "This is good work," she said honestly. "The early rows show your learning process, but these recent inches demonstrate real skill. Your tension is even, your pattern is consistent, and your edges are straight. You should feel proud of what you have accomplished." Tomo's face brightened with pleasure, but she asked seriously, "What should I weave next? I feel ready for something beyond practice, but I do not want to attempt something too difficult and become discouraged." Hana had been considering exactly this question. "I think you should weave a cloth intended for actual use," she said. "Something simple, perhaps stripes in 2 colors, nothing more complex than that, but large enough to be useful perhaps as a carrying cloth or a table covering. This will teach you to maintain consistency over a longer piece, and you will have something practical to show for your efforts." Tomo nodded eagerly. "I would like that very much. When can we begin?" "Tomorrow," Hana replied. "Today you should cut this practice piece from the loom and finish its edges. That will teach you the final stages of cloth making. Tomorrow we will plan your new piece together, choosing colors, calculating thread counts, preparing the loom. Each stage is important and you should experience them all." They spent the remaining hour with Hana guiding Tomo through the process of removing finished cloth from the loom. This required care and attention, cutting warp threads without damaging the cloth, securing ends to prevent unraveling. Tomo worked slowly and deliberately, clearly aware that this was an important skill to master. When the cloth was finally free, she held it in her hands with visible emotion, her first completed piece. Flawed perhaps in its early rows, but undeniably hers, created by her own hands through patient effort. After Tomo departed, Hana returned to her own weaving for the remaining daylight. The workshop felt peaceful in the evening light, and she found her mind settling into that state of absorbed presence that was one of weaving's greatest gifts. The shuttle passed through the shed, the beater pressed forward, the cloth grew steadily. Time seemed to both pass and stand still simultaneously, hours flowing by, yet each moment feeling complete in itself, needing nothing added or taken away. When darkness made further weaving difficult, she secured her work and prepared her evening meal. She roasted the chestnuts Tomo had brought, holding them over coals until their shells charred and split. The smell was rich and slightly sweet, filling the kitchen with autumn's unmistakable fragrance. When they were ready, she peeled away the charred shells to reveal the tender golden meat inside, each one a small treasure, perfect and complete. She ate the chestnuts slowly, savoring their flavor and texture, thinking about the tree that had produced them and the grandfather who had planted it decades ago. How many harvests had that tree yielded? How many people had been nourished by its generosity? The chestnuts connected her to people she had never met, to times before her birth, to the ongoing flow of life that preceded her and would continue after her. The thought was both humbling and comforting. After eating, she spent time in the garden despite the growing darkness, clearing away the dead morning glory vines. The work was straightforward but necessary, making space for whatever would come next. She pulled the withered plants from the trellis, gathering them into a pile that she would later use for compost. The trellis stood bare now, its bamboo poles clean and ready for a new season's growth. The work of clearing away felt appropriate to autumn, this season of harvest and preparation, of gathering in what was useful and releasing what had served its purpose. She appreciated autumn's particular beauty, different from spring's emergence or summer's abundance. Autumn taught letting go, taught the value of emptiness and rest, taught that dormancy was not death but necessary pause in the endless cycle of growth and return. When she had finished clearing the vines, she stood for a moment in the darkened garden, feeling the cool air on her face, listening to the night sounds that were beginning. Crickets sang their evening chorus, though fewer now than in summer's height. A breeze stirred the trees, carrying the scent of turning leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. She returned inside and prepared for sleep, banking the fire in her brazier to coals that would hold warmth through the night. The futon welcomed her, and she pulled the quilt higher than usual, acknowledging the cooler temperatures. Through the paper screens, stars shone with the particular clarity that came with autumn air, each one sharp and distinct against the darkness. Hana, 27 years old, lay with her nimble fingers resting on her stomach, her breathing slow and even. She thought about tomorrow, helping Tamo plan her first real piece, continuing work on her own blue and cream cloth, perhaps beginning preparations for winter dyeing projects. These thoughts moved through her mind without urgency, simply present like clouds drifting across a night sky. Her body relaxed completely into the futon, releasing the day's exertions. The workshop was quiet beyond her sleeping space, the covered loom waiting patiently for morning. The garden rested in darkness, its cleared trellis ready for new growth when spring returned. And she rested too, her breathing growing softer, her awareness dissolving gradually into the wordless realm of sleep. Sleep came as it always did, gentle and complete, and she surrendered to it with trust. The night held her safely. The house creaked softly as it cooled, and within this small dwelling in this ancient city, a weaver slept peacefully, her hands still at last after their day of productive work, waiting for morning to call them once more to the loom, to the thread, to the endless satisfying rhythm of creation that gave shape and meaning to her days, that connected her to countless weavers across time, all of them working with the same patient attention, all of them finding in their craft not just livelihood but purpose, not just occupation but meditation, not just work but a way of being fully present with life itself, thread by thread, breath by breath, moment by moment. The days that followed carried the same gentle rhythm, autumn deepening around Hana as her work at the loom continued its steady progression. The blue and cream cloth grew longer each day, the wave pattern flowing across its surface with the grace she had envisioned. Tamo arrived each morning, her skills strengthening, her confidence building as she prepared to begin her first cloth intended for use rather than practice. The morning arrived when Hana placed the final pass of the shuttle through the blue and cream cloth. She secured the last thread and sat back, looking at the completed piece stretched before her on the loom. It had turned out exactly as she had hoped, the colors working together to suggest water meeting shore, the pattern subtle but clear, the overall quality excellent. She felt that deep contentment that came from seeing a vision fully realized, from bringing something beautiful into existence through patient, careful work. She cut the cloth from the loom with the same ceremony she brought to all such moments, acknowledging the completion, the release of the piece into its own independent existence. When it was free, she carried it to her work table and spread it out, running her nimble fingers across its surface one final time before folding it carefully. The cloth was complete now, ready for whatever use would claim it, carrying within its threads all the attention and care she had invested in its making. At the window, she paused to look out at the garden. The autumn day was clear and mild, the sky a deep blue scattered with small white clouds. The trellis stood bare but somehow expectant, as if already anticipating spring's new growth. The remaining vegetables showed their seasonal colors, green leaves with touches of purple and red, speaking of cool nights and shortening days. Tomo would arrive soon to begin planning her new piece, and together they would choose colors and patterns, calculate thread counts, prepare the teaching loom for this next stage of the young woman's learning. And after that, Hana would begin considering her own next project, perhaps something using the indigo-dyed silk that still hung on pegs along the workshop wall, perhaps incorporating autumn colors to honor the changing season. But those were considerations for later. For now, she simply stood by the window, the completed cloth folded on the table behind her, the empty loom waiting to be warped again, the garden resting in its seasonal transition. The morning light touched everything with golden warmth, and somewhere nearby a bird sang its simple song, 3 notes repeated in an endless pattern that seemed to speak of continuity, of cycles that turned and returned, of work that continued day after day, season after season. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders against the autumn coolness and remained standing there, present with this moment of completion and preparation, of ending and beginning. Her nimble fingers rested against the windowsill. Her breathing was slow and even, and on her face was an expression of deep peace, that familiar emotional baseline that characterized her days, that came from living in alignment with her purpose, from finding meaning in simple work done with complete attention and care. The loom waited, the thread waited, tomorrow's work waited. But for now, in this quiet moment between one project and the next, she simply stood in the autumn light, grateful for her craft, grateful for the teaching she could offer Tomo, grateful for the ordinary beauty that filled each day, the play of light on silk, the scent of earth after rain, the steady rhythm of the shuttle passing through the shed, creating order from individual threads, making wholeness from separate parts, weaving beauty into existence one row at a time, patient and unhurried. Constant as the turning seasons, peaceful as morning light spreading across a garden where everything rested in its appointed place, ready for whatever would come next.